I'm going to provide a hard left from where David began his excellent commentary on understanding polls and the margin of error. Because I don't think we can understand Black Americans and the state of polling in the 2020 election without taking a short detour to understand how, historically speaking, the polling industry has treated Black Americans. Right? When we think of the issues plaguing Black Americans in contemporary polling, for example, small sample sizes, the lack of diversity in the sample, the kinds of questions being asked, and the methods being used, we really can't do so without taking a look at the past. So for the brief time that I'm speaking, I'm going to talk about some of this history of polling and its more like race-oriented, racist aspects. I'll then discuss some of the difficulty with surveying Black Americans. And since I'm not a dark cloud, doom and gloom kind of gal, I'll end on a more positive note about the future of polling Black Americans. So as it pertains to the history of polling Black Americans, I'm drawing most of my notes from two reports. Number one, the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research report that's titled Researching Black American Public Opinion. And number two, a report from Gallup titled Gallup's History of Polling on Black America. And so the first point I want to make about Black Americans and the state of polling is that for far too long in the polling industry, Black people have been targets of white opinions as opposed to agents with opinions. And so what do I mean by that? I mean that if we were to go on Roper, iPoll, or Gallup, we can go all the way back to the 1930s and look at an avalanche of data pertaining to how white people feel about Black Americans, how they feel about interracial dating and bringing a Negro home for dinner, how they feel about Negroes living in their neighborhood, how they feel about Negroes in politics, giving us the right to vote, and the list goes on and on. We don't have that data for Black Americans, right? One of the earliest systematic attempts to measure the attitudes and experiences of Black Americans was conducted by W.E.B. Du Bois with the assistance of Isabel Eaton in 1896 and 1897. The Philadelphia Negro, published in 1899, was based on over 5,000 interviews using structured questionnaires. Du Bois went on to conduct the first of a series of 9 studies of Black communities for the Department of Labor, including work that helped set a foundation for the field of survey research. And during the early years of polling, from 1936 to 1947, both Roper and Gallup note that there was racist bias built into these polling instruments. Why? Right? Why? The Gallup organization, which conducted the largest group of early polls and is the best source of early trends, used election participation as one of the most important criteria in setting quotas for their national adult polls. Black voices were systematically excluded from these polls because Blacks were not allowed to vote in the South and discouraged very strongly from voting in the North. These surveys contained fewer Black Americans in the general population and often none in the South, where poll taxes and other voter suppression techniques prevented voting by Black Southerners. More recently, Eric Schickler and Adam Berinsky have been working with Roper to add some weights to the very little data that their organization does have on Black Americans. It wasn't until the late 1960s, towards the end of the civil rights movement, 1969 to be exact, that pollsters started taking a more serious interest in Black public opinion. But the samples were very small, tiny. Then, as in Du Bois' time, the onus fell on Black academics and elites to produce a survey consisting of samples of Black Americans. In 1979, psychologist Kenneth Clark and Black political and business leader Percy Sutton started Data Black Public Opinion polls with the intention of conducting polls of Black Americans quarterly. The project was short-lived, but it's known as the first polling project focused exclusively on Black Americans, the first. In 1979, 114 years after 1865, this was the first to focus solely on Black public opinion. We then get a few really important surveys from academics, the National Survey of Black Americans, which was the longitudinal study conducted from 1979 to the early 1990s, the National Black Election Study, and the National Black Politics Study. We even now have a few surveys with very large samples of African Americans, but not explicitly focusing on African Americans, the National Politics Study and the CMPS, and thanking all of the scholars who are involved in that work. So why go down this road? I did so to make this simple point. Like, the polling industry has not really been invested in understanding Black public opinion in really meaningful ways, and that remains pretty much true for the most part today. Some of the only times in which we have large oversamples of Black people is when we have racial issues or discrimination dominating news coverage. Right now, we want to know how Black people feel about Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor. So we ask them, just like we wanted to know how Black people felt about the O.J. Simpson trial and the Rodney King beating. There are ebbs and flows, over samples to very little samples. So one of the things that's talked about constantly in trying to get large surveys of Black Americans are the costs. How much it costs to sample this group of people. Where are they? How can we reach them? Anyone that does survey research with Black samples knows that it costs a small fortune to recruit a large sample. So part of this issue with contemporary polling is costs. In addition to the costs, there's wide variation in polls and not a great deal of standardization. So variation in what? The length of the survey, thinking about the amount of questions, the amount of time it takes to complete the survey, the mode of the survey. Are we doing face-to-face interviews? Are we using landlines, cell phones, robocalling? Are we doing online polls? Who even has access to these different modes that we're using? Variation in the time the survey is in the field, which can range from 1 to 7 or more days. And so because there's such wide variation in these polls, it gets really difficult to discern anything meaningful from these already small samples of Black Americans. So the costs are high, the variation is wide, and sometimes the kinds of questions being asked tend not to represent the full Black experience. They lack an intersectional lens. We know a great deal about how cisgender Black folks feel about politics, but little to nothing about the LGBT plus community. We know quite a bit from the polls about how Black people feel about discrimination and very little else. Very little else. How do Black people feel about climate change? How do they feel about healthcare, wage gaps, food insecurity? We don't know very much. So the question that I keep returning to is like, do we really want to know Black public opinion? Does the polling industry and America at large, do they really want to know how Black Americans feel and how raggedy most of us, many of us believe this ramshackle democracy is? And if they really wanted to know, they'd make a way. All right, so I'll stop being a dark cloud. We have hope. Significant strides have been made by academics to pull together large and diverse surveys containing Black public opinion. Gallup recently started the Gallup Center on Black Voices. Pew is beginning to invest more resources in studies of Black Americans. And just this summer, the Roper Center for Public Opinion Research at Cornell launched Say Their Names, Hear Their Voices, a publicly available data collection of surveys of Black Americans and, of course, attitudes about Black America. We also have Ray Block putting in incredible work with the African American Research Collaborative. But we need to hold these polling organizations accountable. It makes no sense that we know so very much about how white Americans feel about Black people breathing, and so very little about the attitudes and behavior of Black people themselves. The polling industry really has to work hard to represent the views of minority groups in an increasingly diverse society. And we really can no longer allow them to collapse the public opinion data into white, non-white, just because the sample of racial and ethnic minorities is small. We need to be trying our hardest to include individuals and marginalized communities and their opinions so that we can be as representative as possible. Polling is an amazing tool that can be put to good use. A vote at the ballot booth only tells us who wins, but it doesn't tell us why. Knowing what people think and are expecting from their leaders is the more important aspect of polls. The purpose isn't horse race coverage. At their very best, polls give us ideas about what people are thinking about politics. They're the pulse of the people. Polls tell us what is motivating people, what people are passionate about, and all of these things harken back to democratic principles like representativeness and accountability. We need to be getting the pulse of all of the people, especially the most politically active racial and ethnic minority in the country, Black Americans. So thank you.